So Salil just finished with a panel focused on founder CEOs with more of a technical background and their struggles and successes in making a business out of it. We're going to continue to talk about business model innovation. We're going to do that with a panel that's composed of three folks that we think do a great job of illustrating this. We're going to have Will Hayes on the panel, who came from Splunk to Lucidworks and has been working with Lucidworks, which is the vendor behind Apache Solar, and Lucene, a vendor in that community, to create a successful business model. Will, if you want to come up and grab a seat. Also got Gary Nakamura. Gary's been in his position for about a year now as CEO of Concurrent, a player in the Hadoop space, creating basically the spring of Hadoop. And before that, he was at Terracotta, where he specialized in the business side of it and helping that company in the Java ecosystem make money. And then we've got Abe Elias, who's CTO of Sencha, founder CTO of Sencha, formerly CEO of Sencha. We just thought it'd be interesting because we think it's such a challenge in this space to make money in the JavaScript space. So we're looking forward to hearing from Abe and his struggles. And I'll turn it over to Salil to moderate.
All right. So Abe and Gary and Will are great people to help me debug my thesis on business models. So I brought some slides for you guys to look at. And maybe I can tell you how I've been thinking about business models, and you can give me some feedback. So what I used to look for here in open source companies is a problem that was a match for open source and not for SaaS. So if it was infrastructure, and if the buyer was technical or developer, then it was a better match for open source. If the buyer was non-technical, but you still wanted to use free or freemium models, then SaaS was a better match. Broad traction in terms of usage, not revenue. Active user community that gives back, and an organization with control of IP, thought leaders, and committers, and high quality revenue. Skip forward one slide, Nate. Oh, no, I've got a clicker here. Doesn't look like it's working. Okay, and so the other thought I had was, are open source and SaaS related effects? Because there's been an evolution in the sales model, deployment model, and pricing model. So it's not that people want things to be free or the source to be available. They just want a better sales experience, better try and buy, better proof of concepts, better deployment, pricing. And that maybe the transition has been because of overselling by closed source companies and naive overbuying by enterprises and some other things. Skip. And so maybe it's not all that different from closed source. Since access to source is rarely a factor, people just want a better experience in buying. The sales model, and also people want the product to keep innovating, keep pace with what's happening, and open source with its model is more likely to do that. So I'll pause there, and I'll start with some questions. And I've got more slides, but I don't want to bore people. So Will, you used to work for Splunk. You were what, employee number 10, 15?
8 or 9.
Yeah. 8 or 9 at Splunk. And
fired a lot of people back in those days.
And then you recently came to Lucidworks. And Lucidworks, if you guys don't know, there are two players in modern enterprise search right now. It's Elasticsearch and Solar. And there, in the old school search, there was Endeca and Fast and lots of things. But in the new school search, it's Elasticsearch and Solar. And Lucidworks is the company behind Solar. But Elasticsearch is the darling of the of the market right now. I was searching for the right word, but I think market is a better word. And so my questions for Will are what's going on, and what was it like to be recruited out of Splunk and join Lucidworks, and how Lucidworks is going to compete with Elasticsearch. Gary used to be at Terracotta before he joined his current company, which is called Concurrent, which is a company behind Cascading, an open source project that's on top of Hadoop. And Gary had the experience at Terracotta of having a really interesting product which was very, very difficult to monetize, and you had to jump through some hoops to figure out what people would pay for. Now, we've done a lot of that with the other companies, so hopefully what I'm hoping here is we would abstract out a little bit and talk about business models in general. And Abe was one of the founders of a project called EXT.js, which later became Sencha. And it's JavaScript. So I think JavaScript is a synonym for hard to monetize. When it's client technology like that, it's hard to figure out how to price it, how to monetize it. So let me start with Gary. Actually, what do you think? What's wrong with what I've said so far, or what are your thoughts on what the right business models are?
Can everybody hear me? There's no one right business model. You have to look at the asset that you have, and
That's so boring.
You really do, and the opportunity is to innovate around the product that in question. At Concurrent, we monetize our installed base, but it's a development framework, and as a previous panel said, it's very difficult to monetize a development framework. And so what we've done is we've built a commercial product that's orthogonal to the development framework that actually adds value, additional substantial value on top of the framework that doesn't obstruct there's no conversation about, well, what's the difference between free and paid. There's a very clean line between what you get for free and the value that you get and what you have to pay for. And so that is that's one way of doing it. GitHub's another great example of a company that took an open source asset and turned it into a business model. I think you're right. It's just a matter of looking at the asset and figuring out what the value add is, whether it's orthogonal or on top, and then really understanding what people are going to pay for, and then you can innovate on pricing. You can innovate on how you deliver the product, whether it's SaaS or download or in the cloud. There's a number of ways to deliver this monetization strategy.
Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I more or less agree with what you have up here. We could definitely enhance it a bit. I think what we tend to find is what are people doing, right? What are those high value use cases that you see time and time again that you can make easier for your users, and that's what you want to go after. So in a lot of cases, I look at it, somebody, I think it was Mark. Mark always says great things because he's one of our board members, and I like to give him his props. But in terms of how do you monetize the platform, is it going to be like, am I going to put a support model on it? Am I going to have some sort of commercial offering? I mean, all those things are kind of great, but at the end of the day, where's the value for the customer, right? So at Lucidworks, we make a point to say, okay, here are some features that we can do across a certain vertical or a certain use case that we can repeat. Let's go productize that to a point that's very specific, that doesn't offend the community because we're not feeding that back in, but we think that we can go after and repeat as a sellable use case. And that would be the only thing that I would enhance this for, is just say, what are the things that people are doing with the technology that we can make easier, faster, stronger, and let's productize that, and let's take that to market and allow the platform to continue to kind of expand people's minds creatively in terms of what they can do.
Okay, I've got follow-ups for both of you. But Abe, how do you make money on JavaScript?
It's quite easy, actually. So I think it's important to understand, why would anyone pay us any money, right? So it kind of goes back to why I even wanted to be involved in this, is that from personal experience, building web applications across browser, it was incredibly difficult, supporting IE6, IE7, IE8, IE9, IE10, IE11, keeps going, right? So Firefox, Safari, et cetera, and then across all the different platforms that they run on. So Windows, Mac, et cetera. So when you have a customer base that's trying to build an application, the last thing that they want to do is figure out all of the differences between all these different browsers. And what we started to find when we started was there were two types of developers. There were the jQuery developers, the prototype developers. I don't know how many of you are into web development, but it was a pretty crowded space. And what we had to determine was, at the time, did we want to have designer devs who are basically building websites as customers and compete with free open source? Or did we want to differentiate ourselves in the market by building really engaging user interfaces that could not otherwise be replicated on the web up until the point we started working on them? And that's what we kind of started to do, was take this huge TAM and then try to find our way into who's willing to pay. And what we found was that designers didn't have or web designers didn't have the requirements of writing an application and having it continue to work 5 years from now. Whereas web app developers kind of had that longer life cycle, so they needed to have a framework that was capable of allowing them to have code that was going to be performant and be future-proofed in future years. So they were more willing to go ahead and actually pay us to kind of give them that insurance of being able to have a consistent user experience across all of these different platforms that they were deploying to. So as a result of that, we decided to really focus our attention on a business buyer who's trying to create an application experience that just works. And as a result, they don't have to have all of the pain associated with supporting all of these different platforms. So it was really like, that was my pain that I was going through. I was building, large-scale infrastructure for condo flipping, basically, and I needed something that could scale. And our developers at the time were constantly frustrated that they made one change here and it worked on Firefox, only to find out that it broke in Internet Explorer. So we normalized all those differences and produced a world-class experience on the web. And I think time has kind of showed that people value that.
Yeah, I was trying to derive a higher level principle from that, but it just sounded like after a lot of trial and error, you figured out who would pay for what, and.
Yeah, well, most developers either don't have budget to pay for stuff, or there's open source alternatives out there that can kind of get them halfway there, and they have to then decide, well, is it in my best interest to continue? Is halfway good enough, or should I invest in something like Sencha that's out there, that's proven? And I think that we have a saying inside Sencha that we're pixel perfect. So when you use a product like Sencha, you're going to get the same exact fidelity across all these different browsers. And that's something that the kind of pain to do that is something that you would only know how to if you did it firsthand. So I think a lot of people go down the path of trying other a permissive open source, only to come back and say, I'd much rather pay for the pleasure of not having pain.
So Gary, back to you. At your prior company, Terracotta, which was a data management company, you tried really, really hard to have a business model, failed, and finally had to buy a company, which is what enabled your business model. So talk a bit about that, and if there's any sort of higher order learning you've had from that experience.
The first, so we started off as a distributed clustering technology. We can pretty much cluster the JVM. It was really, really cool, but good for about one person in the whole world. What we found was people were taking hash maps and concurrent hash maps and then clustering the thing in the JVM and making it a distributed cache. And so the thing that we stumbled upon was started looking at the different use cases and patterns. We started recommending cache as the head end, because was the most prolific cache out there. It's just a get and a put API, and it wasn't that hard. So we set out and said, well, why don't we just build our own distributed cache and our own interface? And then about maybe 6-8 weeks into the process, we said, we should probably, since we've spent 2 years recommending cache, we should probably just go knock on Greg Luck's door and figure out whether or not he's for sale. And so that progressed further, and we had a conversation with him and said, do you want to join? This is what we're trying to do. This is the roadmap. And the net of it is that and this comes back down to what my other point, which I'll say right now, is like just because you're open source doesn't mean you get away from normal product discipline. You still have to figure out what the customer pain points are. You need to figure out how much money and what the market is behind it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Open source is just a platform for which you to get what you need. And the information you need to build products that are either orthogonal or a value add on top of the thing that you're actually shipping. So in the case of EH Cache, we went from delivering a POC in 2 months to POC in 2 hours. So what that meant was anybody who was using EH Cache, and at that time there was probably about 1 million deployments. Today there are probably about 6 to 8 million deployments of EH Cache, because it comes with Spring and Hibernate and so on and so forth. We got it to a point where the product was it's 2 lines of config to actually make an EH cache into a distributed cache. Now, that was all fine and good, but we thought we had nailed it, but the answer was no, we actually didn't nail it. We actually just got to the point where now we had a real product. And so the common questions that came up after that were, well, what's the difference between free and paid? And so that was difficult to swallow, and then we had to persevere on and continue down looking for other pain points. And the next level was, because it was so easy to create a clustered cache, people started putting data into the cache, a lot more of it. And Java garbage collection and data don't play nice. And so we ran into the next bottleneck for the product, which was essentially tuning, which then brought us to the next product innovation. We figured out a way to essentially remove tuning from the equation. So, and that brought us to that was an innovation. But essentially, what that allowed us to do was come up with a new pricing model, which essentially 4x the revenue run rate for the company. So, what we did was we said, people want to put more data into this data store. If you can take tuning off the table, they will put more data into memory, and we started charging based on amount of data that you put into the cache. And so we went from, like early on, like $10,000 sales to when we start building this, additional value. There was absolutely no question from the end user on, do I have to pay for this? When you add that much value to the equation, the question now is, well, how much does this thing cost? Because we need it, right? So that was the big kind of aha for me on use open source as the foundation to understand what products you need to build, what value add you can build, whether it's orthogonal or on top, and then you figure out, okay, well, how best to monetize that. And you got to test it, just like a regular PM does. You got to test it with the end user. And when we got no pushback, that's when you knew you had it, right?
Well, so how about this theory, that the closer you are to runtime and to mission-critical apps in production. So in other words, development versus production. So this is very applicable to you, Abe, because you're very development focused. But the closer you are to mission-critical apps in production, as opposed to non-mission critical apps and non-production apps, and not related to runtimes or deployment, the closer you are to it, the more valuable you are. And is that a higher level or rule of thumb that we could?
Yeah, I don't know. From my standpoint, I think it goes to the pain point of what is the risk involved in not meeting your deadlines or having something go wrong while in production. So there is some merit to that. I think for us, what we started to see was, if we were just to remain on the client side, that eventually we would tap our customer base of people who are developing large-scale applications, who are trying to go ahead and create beautiful interfaces. So what we did recently was to focus in on the deployment story around these applications that they were creating, because there was a huge hole around consumer browsers and being able to securitize your data and deploy to these n number of mobile devices that exist out there with a consistent experience. So we recently got involved into the runtime aspect of it because it was the next pain point. So we came at it probably from a different angle, where a lot of people would build, let's say, another Internet Explorer. We said, hey, we're going to take what's there and build out a rather large ecosystem that developers want to deploy to the browsers, but there's going to be a whole nother set of customers now that are really focused on securitizing and going ahead and making sure that their apps are deployed to the right people inside of their organization. And that's something that the consumer browser just can't do for you.
So if we have time, I'm going to come back and ask you what your investors wanted you to build versus what it made sense to build, and if you can think about what you can share about that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask Will, so Lucidworks, so the project Solar has had its issues because Elasticsearch and Solar are both based on Lucene, and there were all sorts of implementation pains and growing pains between Lucene and Solar. One of the creators of Solar bailed, left Lucidworks, is now still working on Solar at another company, and the company Lucidworks, which was behind this open source project Solar, needed a passionate product person, and they went and got Will from Splunk, which is very unusual. Normally, the passionate product leader sort of germinates from the project, grows up with the project. And so talk a bit about how that happened and how it makes sense.
Such a loaded set of things to cover.
I know, it's intentional.
I mean, first off, let me just say from Splunk's perspective, because we all know Splunk as being this like super expensive proprietary thing that's out there and that's killing it in the market today. But really, I joined in 2005. There was about 7 developers, 1 marketing gal, and it was all about writing code. And when you have a company that's centered around developers and technology, I think you build great product, and great product builds great market opportunities. So that's what I think kind of cultivated me as sort of a young engineer in terms of just being really fiery, really passionate, and then seeing the impact that you could have on the business. So carrying that back into this kind of open source world, I felt like I was almost more ready for it than somebody who maybe was just sort of hacking for fun in that, because we had some intensity behind it. The story of Lucene and Solar and Elastic, I mean, there's a whole telenovel series that can be wrapped up inside of that. It's a very interesting story, but the bottom line is it's all fair in love and open source. Right, and if you have to accept that fact right away. And what I mean by that is that, people are going to move, ideas are going to move, forks are going to happen. And as a business, I think it's understanding, how do I capitalize on these as opportunities?
So what's a higher level learning about business models when these things happen?
Know what your value is. Right. At Lucidworks, we continue to deliver value that makes it easier to recognize or realize the next generation of data-driven application. And as long as we continue to do that, that's why customers are engaging with us. So, the open source becomes an asset that we can leverage. It's a great lead gen for us, because people that are downloading, they're engaging with the company, they're engaging through the mailing list. But at the end of the day, they work with us because we help you get your applications to market faster. And this is what I mean by there are certain capabilities. We do more of an overlay concept on top of the open source, which means if you're deployed in open source, you like working with open source Solar, then moving to Lucidworks means you get all of that goodness unadulterated plus the additional capabilities that we bring in. And that's where we find those repeatable use cases and those capabilities that customers are struggling to implement themselves, and to bring that back into the commercial product. So we don't get hung up so much about what goes into open source, what goes into commercial. Now, again, I'm all over the place because the question was a bit all over the place. Yeah. But in terms of the whole idea around Elasticsearch, I think what was the good thing that came out of that, and I can talk about the Yannick here in a minute as well, was that Solar had been a leader for so long. It was, you could not go to the web and search a search bar anywhere that wasn't going out to www and not hit Solar. I mean, it was that pervasive. And because of that, you get some apathy as a group, right? Because it's sort of like, oh, we're here, it's working. The people who really matter know how to use it, and that's all that I'm going to worry about.
So you were too ubiquitous.
We were, exactly.
And
Whereas what happened in the last 5 years, this whole movement of big data meant that suddenly there was all these consumers of data that needed these natural ways to come in and interact with it. And we saw this at Splunk by accident, right? We were competing with grep, and all of a sudden we were driving next generation business intelligence and security threats and acronyms I had never heard of. So what Elastic was able to do was to capitalize on the fact that if we make this easy, more people are going to adopt search for their big data projects. Now, for Lucidworks, again, we look at that, and then for my coming in product, it's like, okay, here's an opportunity for us to improve. We've got a larger install base, but we need to deliver on this key thing. And I saw something on Twitter that was really interesting the other day, was that usability is a feature. So while we were busy developing really kick-ass search technology for search people, there was a whole other movement that was building more accessible technology for people with data problems, and that market has been growing. So for us to now put an emphasis on usability as being a key feature into this highly scalable, highly distributed system seems kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually one of the most important things we need to do to insulate solar for the future. So that's where we're investing heavily, both in the open source and then in our commercial projects.
So Elasticsearch just took an open source project and did their own thing with it. And that's generally considered uncool.
The forking, and again, it's hard to even tell anymore, right? Because I do feel that, you know, Lucidworks and Solar, I mean, this is one of, and no offense to anybody else here, but I mean, this is one of the more traditional pure play open source companies. I mean, if anybody was really kind of initially setting out to be the Red Hat of X, and I don't necessarily agree that that's the perfect business model, but it really just came from the community, it came from the creators, and they formed a company to do products and services, or do services and support. Whereas companies like Elastic, and a lot of what we see now is open source, it's just a route to market. And it's great. I mean, that's how you should look at it, you know, is how do we want to take this to market? Is it part of our strategy or not? Not that, hey, we're going to go build this big kumbaya and the community is going to come, because quite frankly, if you're not delivering value, nobody's going to care, you know? I mean, we talked about Splunk freemium. I mean, we made sure that while we limited the capacity, the value was there in that kick-ass interface, and that's why people started adopting it, although it wasn't open source, which is why developers don't use Splunk today. Whole nother session on that one, but.
Did you want to talk about, so you raised $15 million, as a startup, you raised $15 million from Sequoia, and then another 10 or 15 from Jeffco.
Yeah, 14 and 15, or 15 and 14.
And so what was the business model thought to be at that time? Because I know it's different now.
Yeah, so the initial business model was somewhere along in my head was around cheap software, not necessarily free. But so our biggest competitor in the space on the front end side was charging around $2,000 a developer, and we said, you know what, if we open source this, we'll get, you know, we'll be able to trim our QA expenses, we'll be able to get a lot more word of mouth adoption. So we came out with a product at $199. And, you know, a combination of both open source and a relatively easy price point for people to go ahead and pull out, you know, their credit card and buy it, kind of helped, you know, the momentum of our product. So it was a slow mover market. You know, it was something that it was primed for innovation. Everyone was trying to build Flex and Flash interfaces and, you know, Java applets at the time. And we decided, hey, that's too proprietary, so we decided to go ahead and build it on the web. So around 2007, we were doing that pretty successfully on the desktop. So everyone who was trying to build, you know, world-class user interface was using, you know, X on the for their UI. And what we saw was that around the same period of time, the iPhone comes out, and the same runtime that was on your browser was now running on your phone, right? It's Safari. Everything before that was WAP. So we decided, hey, we got to get away from trying to build on top of these native ecosystems. So we approached Sequoia and said, hey, history is going to repeat itself. We don't know when, but what we envision is that the same exact tool chain that, you know, people are building today, which is what, you know, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for the desktop, is going to be enabled on mobile. And this is back when iOS was the dominant platform, Android was just coming out, and Torch Mobile was just acquired by BlackBerry. So we saw that the indications of having JavaScript or a WebKit on these mobile devices was going to be the way to go to market for around mobility. So the initial investment was to take our desktop tool that we had, our desktop SDK, and make it work on mobile. So that was the first project that we kind of undertook, and that was called Sencha Touch. And we were the first HTML5 SDK that was out there that kind of replicated the experience that you can get on native phones, on a native platform like iOS. And we were hoping that Android was going to come out and was going to be on par with what we were seeing from iOS as far as the ability to GPU accelerate many of the layers on WebKit using CSS animations. But that didn't really happen, and we started to really second guess, like, is HTML5 going to be there? So what we had to do was now forward invest in the actual runtime itself. So we started hiring a bunch of WebKit committers and trying to go ahead and solve all of the problems to the web, because we wanted the web to win. And that was kind of the first Series A, was kind of make HTML5 the predominant way in which applications are created on mobile, and we envision that to actually happen, over the next 5 years or so. It's definitely taken off on the business side, not so much on the consumer side. But the second 15 million was more around building, a service, right? And that was around MBAS and things like that, and that was something that. It was a little bit of divergent for us. What's a JavaScript framework company building MBAS, and that's something that didn't really pan out as far as our customers, because we would ask our customers, do you need MBAS? And they would say, no, I'm
what
pretty
is
good.
that?
Yeah, I'm pretty mobile backend as a service, and they're like. No, I have my Apache server and my LAMP stack, or I'm using Node. Why do I need that stuff? So, it was really, trying to solve a problem that
but it's
didn't
interesting
exist.
that you wanted a runtime service that you could monetize better.
We did, and I think that was the, the goal was to try to find one. And I think where we're heading now, the runtime is actually on the client. Because again, everything that we do is thick client, so why not focus our attention where our bits actually run? So our focus now is more on runtime on the actual endpoint, as opposed to a runtime that sits in the cloud or sits in some data center. So it's just still looking for that runtime component, because it's easier to monetize, let's say, the end user than it is the developer who's building out their product. So our focus now is really focusing on making sure that we have a good runtime. We have our own WebKit that we ship on Android. That's probably 10 times faster than the existing WebView that Android ships today, and just kind of augmenting it with APIs that really matter to developers, because the web right now, as far as a consumer browser goes, is really not innovating as fast as we would like. So we're taking on the burden of innovating inside of the browser ourselves.
Gary, any last words before we close up? I'm probably not going to take questions from the audience. We're short on time.
Do you want me to say anything?
No.
I'll
If you can abstract anything for the top 3 business models are, that's a lot to ask, but something like that.
That's a hard one.
It doesn't have to be that.
I don't think there's a top 3. I really do think it comes down to what asset do you have, and what foundation are you building off of? In the case, so I'm at Concurrent. In the case of cascading, that's the open source asset. It's the very popular data application development framework on top of Hadoop. So our users don't have to touch a line of Hadoop code. They get to think in terms of their data, the business problem that they're trying to solve, and cascading takes care of the maps and reduces and so on and so forth. There's companies like Twitter and eBay and that sort of those sorts of companies that are using it. These are companies that are trying to operationalize their data. Now, to your earlier point, the founder of the company, Chris Wenzel, had the foresight enough that there is a runtime inside of cascading. We are not directly monetizing the runtime, but the types of applications that get built on cascading are business critical applications. So they end up being applications like all of Twitter's revenue apps and all of eBay's backend on e-commerce, all of Etsy, Stripe fraud detection, so on and so forth. They are business critical applications. The end result of that was people built application after application after application, and they have hundreds of applications, which then brought the pain to the forefront for us. How do we manage the 800 applications that we have right now? The answer is, I don't know, and we have a product that solves that. So you really do, the main point is you really do have to go back down to first principles of understanding what customer pain points you're trying to solve.
So to just take a stab at it, so Sencha has multiple business models, which is interesting based on the product. So the ones that I think, the three that we use is, try and buy. We have a freemium, and then we have commercial open source. And they all apply to different types of segments and different types of customers. So on the commercial open source side, that's tailored for the developers. Get them excited about what they're using. And then as we move upstream into a more of a productivity tool, we have something like a drag and drop designer, which is try and buy. Because ultimately the source doesn't matter, right? For those types of buyers. And then for the actual end users or the IT side of the house, we have a freemium model that kind of gets them just download it, use it, and then as you eventually have some sprawl inside of the organization, that's when you have to come back and buy. So depending on the buyer and depending on the product, we've employed basically different sales models and go-to-markets around that.
I'll just do a quick plug on something that we did, because I hear people
And then
talk
we have to wrap.
a lot about insurance, and then we'll wrap it up here. Insurance policies work when in an open source model a lot of times, but you also have to recognize, I think, to your point, what your assets are. And in those cases, your assets can be people. So we were in a business of selling break-fix support on open source Lucene Solar, which is a 10-year-old project, and guess what? It's quite stable. People know how to deploy it. They've got expertise in-house. So we had to repackage that offering so the perception with the customer wasn't, oh, you're going to have insurance for when things go down, because when we went for a renewal and they never opened a ticket, that wasn't always an easy conversation, into a more proactive model where we're giving you access back to committers, we're giving you insight into roadmap, we're mapping roadmap back into your application. So I think you can take some of the same models and package them a little more creatively and leverage the assets which you have, which in a lot of cases open source, and being the company, it's going to be your people. So how can you turn those people into product in a way that's not getting them on the WebEx every time something breaks, but having some exclusivity and some special access from a customer perspective that says, I need to maintain this relationship whether or not I'm calling them to open tickets. So,
Excellent. Abe from Sencha, Gary from Concurrent, and Will from Lucidworks. Thanks, guys.